Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first in the series of our podcasts on American literature. Welcome to the launch of our SUSI PALS project in 2024. My name is Anna, and today I will be talking about American 19th century poetry, or rather about two key figures in American 19th century poetry, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. These two prominent figures with two very different life paths, with two very different approaches to poetry and to the role of a poet in public. With many differences in their outlooks, but regardless of these differences, both Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman left a long-lasting mark on American and world poetry, and both of them influenced future generations of poets. American 19th century poets faced the same problems and challenges as other early American writers. They had to look for new means of expression. They had to look for new verse patterns in order to do away with the European traditional models, because the new country required new voices and new imaginative ways to describe the American experience. In order to start this discussion of important American poetic figures in the 19th century, we need to turn back to Ralph Waldo Emerson, because his works and his essays and his philosophy actually provided blueprints for an ideal American poet. In his essay called The Poet, published in 1844, Emerson lists the qualities of a true poet. First of all, he or she should be the representative of all men and women, the one who stands among his or her generation, and the one who speaks about their generation using the language that represents beauty. According to Emerson, the poet is one of the key persons of an era, the one with a special ability to see into the future and speak about it, the sayer, the namer, the one who represents beauty. Emerson even goes as far as calling poets liberating gods, whereas in his words, America is a poem. In other words, poets are the ones with the synthesizing power, the power to unite all men and nature, to intuit the knowledge, and to communicate that knowledge back to the world. Directly or indirectly, Emerson inspired the first great American poets, great in their innovations of poetic expression that clearly delineated American poetry from the courtly muses of Europe, to use this Emerson's phrase. According to him, the poet as a crucial figure in any age is a representative who stands out among the crowd as a whole person, not defined by his technical skills with words only, but the one who knows and tells the truth about spirit. That's the one who earns the title of the poet, a literary god, as he called. The ultimate yeah-sayer, a relatively underappreciated 19th century poet, but a major liberating influence among the 20th century poets and an iconic figure in the 21st century. He was born on Long Island in 1819, a son of a small farmer, later a Brooklyn resident, without an Ivy League education. Unlike many other American 19th century classics, Whitman was far from the New England elite. However, his genius and his unwavering dedication to poetry, democracy, American values, and Emerson's ideals turned him into a top figure among American and world poets. Throughout his life and his career, Whitman remained unswervingly loyal and dedicated to American democracy, but also sometimes harshly opposed, the one who stood against the laws he thought unjust. He worked as a printer, he worked as a journalist, he worked as a teacher, but also as a carpenter and a volunteer nurse during the Civil War. He was also very political, very aware of his and his country's political and social circumstances. So, for example, he quit his job when his editor refused to print a text opposing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And he managed to incorporate the details of all of these experiences, including his family tragedies, into his poems. Whitman's first and most significant publication was his first collection of poetry called Leaves of Grass, published in 1850 for the first time and revised, redacted, rewritten, and expanded until his death. The first edition contained only 12 poems, a title page, and an engraving with Whitman's portrait. No name or any other detail to identify either the author or the poems. Whitman wrote, printed, bound, and circulated the book himself. The poems had no titles, and the reader had to actually go through the book in order to learn the name of the author, suggested in what will later become known as Song of Myself. Many 19th century readers and critics found his poetry collection shocking and inappropriate, as it contained some, for the historical and cultural context of the time, graphic images. However, the one person whose opinion mattered, Ralph Waldo Emerson, realized that Whitman's poetry was true American poetic declaration of independence. In his preface to the collection, Whitman states his mission, and he says, "The Americans of all nations at any time upon the earth have probably the fullest poetical nature. The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem. The American poets are to enclose old and new for America in the race of races. Of them, a bard is to be commensurate with a people." He embraces the role of the bard, the poet who sees further than anyone else and sings about it, conveys a message to the collective, and leads the way. The bard uses his individual voice to tell the collective experience. That is why his Song of Myself is at the same time about the birth of a poet, as well as about America and all its contradictions, minorities, underrepresented and silent voices, democracy. Whitman, as the bard, speaks on behalf of everyone. He possesses the mystic ability to see the miraculous in the common and to achieve unity in diversity, reconciling the opposites. The bard is able to see in the distance the mystical line between the sky and the sea, the horizon, and to point everyone in that direction. The most important innovation and Whitman's lasting legacy is his invention of free verse. Versification without distinctive rhyming or metrical patterns. He was dubbed the American inventor of free verse, destroyer of the iambic pentameter. Whitman became the bard for future generations of poets as well. The verses of his Song of Myself imitate a human pattern of talking and breathing. The poem itself becomes like a living organism. No required rhyme meant liberating American poetry from the bounds of tradition and the English metrics. It was genuinely novel expression, congenial to the requirements of the new age. Furthermore, by introducing all subjects into poetry without any taboos, Whitman effectively liberated poetry and ushered modernism into the American literature. In other words, he fused form and function. Poetry and free verse became means to express the ideas of freedom and democracy. A hallmark of his poetic style is a catalog, a stylistic device he uses to represent the totality and comprehensiveness of nature in the Song of Myself and his other poems. A catalog could be defined as a longer poetic passage which contains large numbers of related concepts and images, juxtaposed similarly to scientific categorizing. The purpose of these poetic catalogs was to emphasize multitudes of often contradictory concepts and images, and by putting them together to demonstrate the ideas of unity in diversity, equality, democracy, and equal representation. The title of the entire collection, Leaves of Grass, carries a deep symbolic meaning. Grass grows everywhere and is suggestive of democracy and the equal civic status of the poor and the rich, whom Whitman equally represents in his poem. In Canto 6, of his Song of Myself. The numbers of the cantos were added later for the sake of clarity. The poet says, "A child said, 'What is the grass?' fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name somewhere in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff. I give them the same, I receive them the same. And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves." Just by looking at the structure of the poem, the length of the verses, the fact that there is no predictable rhyming pattern, the fact that there is no predictable number of syllables in every line, this testifies of this notion of the fusion between form and function that I mentioned earlier. You can see that the poem also flows naturally, like a human pattern of speech, like a human pattern of breathing. So the poem actually imitates life. And the poet tries to give the answer to a very simple question asked by a child, and at the same time raises this issue of most basic symbolism, of most basic meaning of language, how to explain something that seems at least very simple. What is the grass? That is at the same time the answer to the question why the grass represents the central image. And by offering this number of different answers, first of all by acknowledging that the poet himself does not know what grass is, cannot attach a single fixed meaning to grass. This opens up the discussion and the potential meaning and the potential symbolism of that central image, of that central metaphor. It could be something that reminds one of optimism, hopeful green stuff. Or, for those who believe in God, it could be a remembrancer of the Lord. Or the grass could be the babe of the vegetation, as the poet uses this phrase. But then he says it could be a uniform hieroglyphic, so some sort of a universal symbol, as grass will grow anywhere. It could also be a representative of the lowest and the highest in the society. And it's very important that the poet mentions and names all of them, using different names, sometimes derogatory names. And in that way, he also kind of purifies them, makes them magnificent, makes them worthy of poetry. And in that way, poetry offers a transformative power. So on one hand, we can see the multiplicity of imagery, the multiplicity of meaning. Then we can see the freedom of the poetic expression. And we can also see this transformative power of poetry and the transformative power of the poet. Or, in another canto, he gives this very long list, this catalog of different people, of different members of the American society, if you will. And he says, the bride unrumples her white dress. The minute hand of the clock moves slowly. The opium eater reclines with rigid head and just opened lips. The prostitute draggles her shawl, her bonnet bobs on her tipsy and pimpled neck. The crowd laugh at her blackguard oaths. The men jeer and wink to each other. Miserable, I do not laugh at your oaths nor jeer at you. The president holding a cabinet council is surrounded by great secretaries. And this could probably be something that the 19th century readers found shocking, the fact that he juxtaposes the prostitute and the president. So someone who is very low on the social ladder in the American society and someone who holds the highest position. And by juxtaposing them, by putting them together, by including them all in his poems, he also gives them equal importance. And in that way, through his poem, he celebrates democracy and equality and equal representation. So he uses poetry also as a vehicle, as a means to give voice and to give representation to those who are not necessarily represented in all American institutions. So one more time, he goes back to this transformative power of poetry. Could be considered a romantic celebration of democracy and a romantic celebration of the common people. And it's also very important that he calls the poem a song of myself, and the poem becomes an account of a birth of a poet, but then moves into something bigger, into something larger, into the celebration of the entire American society. So this poetic figure, this bard, actually includes all the masses, all the multitudes of meanings, of different characters, the highbrow and the lowbrow. So everyone is represented, and everyone, as he puts it, sits at this table of democracy. Because of all his contributions to American and world poetry, Whitman remains the iconic figure among poets all over the world. His portrait on the title page of the first edition of Leaves of Grass, the face and figure of a relaxed man in casual clothes, and this cultural significance of a rebel against convention, so convinced of the importance of poetry and utterly dedicated to the art of poetry, combined with social consciousness, they're still the hallmark of a poet. The Whitmanic tradition in American poetry was carried on, for example, by the Beat movement in literature, whereas the hippie counterculture in the 20th century hailed Whitman as their role model. Although contemporary poets mostly do not share Whitman's fascination with American democracy, they still use his legacy of free verse and the idea that an individual with a specially attuned consciousness of everything and everyone around them is a perfect poet, a spokesperson for an entire generation.